next speaker is Brian Lee Crowley, who is the Managing Director of the MacDonald-Laurier Institute. If you go outside, he's the author of an amazing book called Fearful Symmetry, The Rise and Fall of Canada's Founding Values. And when I read this book, I was astounded at the fact that I didn't even recognize some of the history that's in this book. The plain fact of the matter is that we always think of Canada as this welfare state, when in fact, right up until Louis Saint Laurent, our leaders were laughing at the US for their welfare state. And the fact that hard work was what counted in Canada. All of this documented in Brian Lee Crowley's amazing book. You might see Brian fairly often in the Ottawa Citizen with his columns. He actually does get on the CBC, which is pretty amazing. His website is briancrowley.com. He lives in Ottawa. Please welcome Brian Lee Crowley.
Well, something Salim said reminded me of a little story, sort of taken from the Arabian Nights, about this man who finds a lamp and rubs it, and the jinn emerges from the lamp. He says, "I'm sorry, I only get to grant one wish today." The guy says, I want to live forever." The jinn says, "I'm sorry, I don't have the power to grant that wish. I can't make you live forever. You have to ask for something else." The guy says, "I want to live until the Toronto Maple Leafs win the Stanley Cup." And the kid looks at him and says, "You crafty bastard." I'm a Habs fan. Ladies and gentlemen, for me, the starting point for any discussion about how to reconcile our deep commitment to freedom, including freedom of conscience and religion, with our enemies' willingness to use our freedom against us, comes from these famous words of the legendary American judge and Nuremberg prosecutor, Robert Jackson. Mr. Justice Jackson dissented in a famous case called Terminiello versus Chicago in 1949, where the majority overturned the conviction of a priest whose anti-Semitic and pro-Nazi ranting at a rally had incited a riot. The court held that Chicago's breach of the peace ordinance under which the priest had been charged violated the First Amendment. And in his dissent from that decision, Jackson famously wrote, and I quote, "The choice is not between order and liberty. It is between liberty with order and anarchy without either. There is danger that, if the court does not temper its doctrinaire logic with a little practical wisdom, it will convert the Constitutional Bill of Rights into a suicide pact." I believe that the lesson Mr. Justice Jackson was trying to impart is in no way limited to the American Constitution or the Bill of Rights. It is a meditation on the fact that the very freedoms that we enjoy, freedoms that are absolutely foundational to our way of life in Canada, as a Western, liberal democratic society, grown out of the great British tradition of liberty, those indispensable freedoms expose us to dangers that we cannot wish away. It cannot have been the intention of the authors of those rights to have created a society that is incapable of protecting itself from those who find our values not merely wrong, but abhorrent, and who consider that any and all means to destroy us are not only allowed, but are imperative. As Jackson said, our precious freedoms exist at the intersection of rights and order. Liberty without order is mere anarchy. Order without liberty is authoritarianism or worse. But where to strike the balance is necessarily a matter of judgment. There is little in the way of hard and fast rules to guide us. And this implies, I believe, that in thinking about the challenge posed by Islam and Islamism, we must think not in terms of absolutes, but of the balancing of competing but complementary values. Because if we allow our legitimate fear of Islamism, very well described this evening by the two speakers who preceded me, to outweigh our commitment to religious freedom, including for the tenets of Islam, one of the world's great religions, we become authoritarian and intolerant, and we destroy the free society. If, on the other hand, we kid ourselves that radical or militant Islam is not a serious threat to public order and public safety, we risk a serious decline in public trust, as fearful citizens lose confidence in the safety of their society and bullies have their way with us. Either way, freedom is deeply endangered. And having the discussion of how to hold freedom and order together relies absolutely on our being willing to talk openly about the nature of the challenge that we face, unlike, say, the initial reports of the arrests of the group that became known as the Toronto 18, when, as you may recall, an RCMP officer involved in the operation described the arrested suspects as representing, quote, a broad strata of Canadian society. And the Toronto Star claimed that it was, quote, difficult to find a common denominator among them, even though all were radical Muslims and many attended the same mosque. Such behavior is just as likely to turn our rights into a suicide pact as the opposite, illiberal and revolting reaction of extremists who, on the night following the arrest of the Toronto 18, vandalized mosques in both Rexdale and Etobicoke in Toronto. Canadians, of course, have no monopoly on ignorant and illiberal sentiments in the face of such radical Islamist outrages. Congressman Peter King, for example, was reported to have said that there's a large al-Qaeda presence in Canada because of their very liberal immigration laws, because of how political asylum is so easily granted. Of course, the thing that shakes so many of us about these incidents is the extent to which their authors so often are not recently arrived and poorly assimilated immigrants, but on the contrary, are people either born here or who arrived at a young age and who have benefited from everything that Canadian society has to offer more or less throughout their entire lives. So, a robust freedom knows how to protect itself without losing its precious essence. But such self-protection means knowing how to hold together the seeming opposites of freedom and order. And it's worth taking a moment to understand how we have traditionally done this, because I think once explained, this approach will command the agreement, or at least the assent, of everyone who thinks that freedom matters. Remember that in the free society, we are committed to a vision of inner, directed human flowering. In other words, that we as individuals make our own choices about what is good for us, and we live the consequences of those choices. No one, no policeman, no legislator, no religious authority, no philosopher is entitled to make us do what we do not choose for ourselves. We are not required to worship at a common altar, or to vote for a compulsory candidate, or to hew to a single line about the economy, the environment, the human soul, or anything else. But there is a corollary. That corollary is that we may believe whatever we want. And what goes on in our minds is private and not the province of legislators or police. But we are not entitled to act on beliefs or ideas that impinge on the protected sphere of rights and personal security that we promise to all members of society. I cannot insist on this too strongly. It is not illegal, nor should it be a radical Muslim, to believe that infidels are a disgrace in the eyes of God, or to believe that the Quran supersedes human-made law. It is not illegal. What is and must be illegal is to act on those beliefs. It's to act on those beliefs. Why? It is not, first and foremost, because of the practical society in which people are free to kill or enslave each other because they disagree about beliefs. It's true that it would be impossible to live in a society like that, and that is an important supplementary argument, but it is not the foundational argument. The foundational argument, the one that has dominated our thinking since it was given its modern formulation by Immanuel Kant, is quite simple. In the free society, we are not entitled to use each other as means to our ends. We are not entitled to use each other. Individuals are ends in themselves, and that means we are forbidden to use any kind of coercive means to impose our views on others, up to and including murdering people who disagree with us as a means of intimidating members of our society and of undermining our institutions. Religious beliefs as a justification for such behavior are no more acceptable than any other justification for that kind of behavior. Indeed, in our tradition, the idea of toleration of differences of values and beliefs comes straight out of Britain's experience of the conflict that arose when people of different religious persuasions sought to seize the power of the state as a means of making others behave as if they shared the beliefs of the victorious creed. As Thomas Hobbes, the great underrated political philosopher, taught us, the problem with basing public policy on beliefs about what God enjoins us to do is that even if we all agree that we should do what God wants us to do, there is no agreed upon means of determining what that is, since God is not available to be questioned. There is no objective test of God's will. So in the face of competing and mutually contradictory holy books, all purporting to describe God's will for humanity, there are only two choices available which are compatible with social order. One is the choice of the radical Islamists, that is to say, to use violence and coercion to force people to behave as if they agreed with the tenets of Islam, even if they do not. This, of course, is the illiberal option. The liberal option, the only one compatible with a free society, says that all forms of coercion over beliefs are forbidden. Only voluntary conversion, the use, which, by the way, by definition, voluntary conversion is the use of